Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Been a while since I was able to record, so let's jump right into it. There's a lot to talk about. Patreon.com// Eric Draitser is where you can go to find all of the videos that I've been doing basically since the day this war started, and there's a lot more going back before February 24th. But let's talk about a couple of key issues here. One I've already discussed, and I'm going to lead off with because it is so important. And I would just refer back to a couple of weeks ago. I did another video on the subject of Russia's debt and the so called debt default. And the reason I say so called is, of course, this is not like any default that we've ever really seen in modern times, because this is a default that is essentially happening because the United States has frozen the Russians out to a large extent of the global economic system. And unlike in prior instances where there has been a default, the country that is defaulting is not unwilling to pay and is not in a situation where they don't have the ability to pay. Russia both has the ability to pay and wants to pay. Let's talk through what is actually happening. This is actually part of the broader issue that I've been discussing for quite a long time now, namely the form of economic warfare that the United States is waging against Russia in response to Russia's illegal and criminal invasion of Ukraine. And I keep saying that because I just want to reiterate the point for everybody as you're listening to me talking, that ultimately all of this is part of the crime of aggression that the Russians have carried out against Ukraine, while simultaneously being part of the even broader issue of US imperialism. So you have competing issues happening simultaneously, and unfortunately, certain elements of the left seemingly are unwilling or unable to hold both of those ideas in their mind at the same time. So in any event, let's jump right into it. Um, I hope the video is not lagging behind the audio because it looks like that when I'm recording, but I don't know. Anyway, there's been a number of articles written on the subject. As I already mentioned, this would be, if Russia ultimately defaults, this would be the first time that we have ever seen a major emerging market economy pushed into a bond default, not because of economics and finances, but because of politics. Okay, so it wouldn't be like in other situations where a country is simply broke and cannot pay and is forced to default on its loan obligations. In this case, the Russians can pay and are not able to for various reasons that we'll talk about. Russia, ever since 1991, since the end of the Soviet Union, Russia's had an extremely strong solvency record. This has been a country that for a long time has been very attractive to international investors, those who are looking to buy these kind of sovereign bonds. Russia has been quite lucrative for a lot of people. And for that reason, it comes as something of a shock that we are now in 2022, a shock to investors, I should say, that we are now in 2022 and this country with such a glowing track record is now reduced into this position. Of course, we'll talk about how that actually works. So they had a strong solvency record, but it's more than that with regard to Russia. Russia also has extremely high export revenues, which means that it's not only that they have the finances in their accounts, but that they have the ability in the future to generate more revenue. That's of course extremely valuable for investors who can sort of bank on Russia continuing to be, churning out the exports and bringing in the revenue from that. And then the other thing that Russia's had going for it for quite a long time, and we've actually seen this really brought into, into prominence here in the last couple of months, an active and strong central bank, a central bank that is not only, responding to the whims of President Putin, but a central bank that understands the nature of global finance, that has proven rather resilient in terms of its policies and has proven to be focused on key economic issues like fighting inflation. We've seen that since the war began. What's her name? Nabulina, I believe, who is the head of the central bank in Russia, has long been seen by central bankers around the world as one of the preeminent sort of experts on central banking. And she and her central bank have, to be honest, worked some wonders in the last couple of months to help keep Russia afloat, to stabilize the currency, and so forth. Of course, we've seen the Russian ruble, surge to one of its strongest points in recent memory. That is on the back of some of these central bank policies. Excuse me. So, how is this actually happening? How is it that Russia, with all of this export revenue, with all of the money that it has, how is it unable to make these payments? Well, it has to do with the US Treasury. And again, this points to what I've been speaking to many times before about the nature of US hegemony and of US imperialism, that it is more than just the expansion of NATO. It is more than just military bases in almost every country in the world. It's more than the military industrial complex or the president or anything like that. That much of it has to do with the dollar, and especially with the US Treasury and the US Treasury's market securities, all of these aspects of that are sort of under the purview of the US Treasury. That is to a large extent what makes the US economy central to the global financial system, and also what gives the United States this degree of leverage. In other words, the US dollar, but more than just the dollar, the US Treasury Department itself is a potent weapon of US imperialism. This has to be understood, because only when you understand it that way can you understand the nature of the conflict that's emerged between Russia and the United States on the economic front. Okay, so the US Treasury is not extending the license that would allow Russia to continue to make these debt payments. In other words, if you're some hedge funder here in New York who has, tremendous exposures in Russia, who has invested in Russia and invested obviously millions and millions of your clients' money in Russia, you are now in a very bad situation, because the US Treasury has said you are not allowed to accept payment from the Russians. In other words, punishing the Russians not by stopping them from doing anything, but by preventing, call them the creditors, from accepting payment. That's something very, very different. Again, it is not that the country can't make the payments; it's that those bondholders cannot accept those payments. Something very different and very insidious. You have to keep an eye on that. And it actually, it sort of figures centrally in all of this. So Russia has recently wired money, roughly $100 million in interest payments. That money will not show up in the accounts of those bondholders. And those bondholders, until they receive the money, ultimately they see it as default. In other words, if I hold Russian debt and I expect to be paid, that debt to be serviced and the payment to appear in my account, the fact that it's not appearing in my account, for all intents and purposes, means Russia has defaulted on its obligation to me. Now multiply that by tens of thousands of potential clients, and you can see what we're talking about here. That in other words, the default is not happening because Russia can't pay. The default is happening because the creditors are forbidden from accepting the payments. That is what you might call a sort of a politically motivated form of default, something that has never happened before. And in fact, this would set an extremely, dangerous on the one hand, but also an extremely powerful precedent from the perspective of the US and US imperial agenda. So that 100 million has been made. That the payment has been made. Some call this a default. Some are saying it's not because the Russians are making the payment. But irrespective of that, there's plenty more to come for the end. By the end of this year, roughly $2 billion is due by the end of 2022 in various forms of servicing, these debts or paying the bondholders. Now, you do have prior instances where this has happened, where you've seen defaults, countries like Iran in 1979, Venezuela just a couple of years ago in 2019. But both of those examples are really sort of apples and oranges as compared to this situation. Iran in 1979, after the revolution there, the amounts were relatively small, did not significantly impact the global financial system, the global economy. Similarly with Venezuela, although the number was big, I believe it was like $60 billion that they had defaulted on. Venezuela was essentially already a broken economy by 2019. U.S. sanctions had strangled that country for years leading up to that in ways ways that the Russians have never had to deal with, because the sanctions on the Russians have been somewhat targeted and really focused on individuals. So the Venezuelans, even though they were in that situation, the circumstances were extremely different. In other words, both of those countries could not make the payments for various reasons. The Russians are able, or rather, they have the funds to make the payments. They are not able to on a technical level. Difference. Russia, like I said, Russia has all the money that it needs based on export revenue. Just look at surging oil prices and gas prices to see how much potential there is for Russia to continue raking in this revenue. That revenue would, of course, go to servicing some of this debt if they were able to do so. But it does speak to what you would expect to be a level of investor confidence, because the Russians have all of these natural resources for export. But this raises an interesting question. The Russians have already had their reserves, or at least a portion of their reserves, frozen by the actions of the United States and the other players internationally, and yet Russia can still make all of its payments on the back of these increased export revenues. Now, Russia has defaulted before, but it hasn't happened in like 100 years. 1917, in the Russian Revolution, I believe, is the last time you had an official Russian default. And this is, I mean, we're talking 100 plus years ago. All of the things that have happened in Russia since then, including the dissolution of the Soviet Union and all of that, never had we found ourselves in this situation, even in the depths of Russia's decline, economic decline in the early 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. The U.S. Treasury is an interesting player, as I already mentioned. In other words, by forcing the expiration of the license, they are essentially making it so that the creditors are forced to refuse payment. So imagine if you're a hedge funder in Wall Street or whatever, and you want to take this payment, but you can't. The U.S. Treasury says you cannot, and you most certainly, beyond anything that the Russians could offer, beyond anything that increased revenue might offer, you do not want to run afoul of the U.S. Treasury. That would potentially destroy your entire business. So you can imagine why people, hedge funders, other investors are willing to sort of cut their losses on Russia. So Russian bonds, speaking of cutting their losses, Russian bonds are now essentially junk bonds. They are trading at somewhere between 13 and 26 cents on the dollar, which is, of course, a total collapse of their value. Bond holders themselves are being pressured to dump Russian bonds. Now, this is another aspect of this. It's all tied together, of course, but I just want to break it apart so that people can understand the different moving parts here. It is not only that the U.S. Treasury is preventing bondholders from accepting the payments, it is also the clients themselves are now kind of, imagine you go to your investment professional, you're a multimillionaire who's invested all over the world, and you're watching the news just like everybody else. Maybe you have a Ukraine flag on your profile, or your friends are hosting a Ukrainian refugee family or whatever. You pick up the phone, call your investment guy and say, look, dump everything Russia. I don't want to make money with these people. I don't want to do business with them. I don't want to fund their war machine. Get me out of there. Do what it takes to get me out of that exposure, that position, right? So now you have sort of the political side of this coming to bear on the financial side. So there are plenty of wealthy people in the West who don't want anything to do with Russia, irrespective of whether or not they could continue to make money off of this. Now, I'm not speaking of vulture investors who probably are circling around the Russian, economic carcass here, looking to pick the bones clean. But for most investors, most normal investors who are owning these bonds, they want to get out of them, just like corporations want to get away from Russia, irrespective of how much it might cost them, irrespective of the sunk costs and all of that. For political, public relations, marketing reasons, they don't want to be in Russia. They don't want to be exposed in Russia. And similarly for some of these investors too. This, of course, also, the default would also increase the cost of borrowing and the cost of funding. In the future, say Putin goes away, a more liberal government comes into power, and the investment climate changes, people aren't going to forget about this default. People aren't going to forget about the risk of investing in Russia because of this. So, in essence, between Putin's actions in waging the war and the US Treasury's actions in isolating Russia from the global economy, they are essentially creating an environment for perhaps decades to come where Russia is not going to be a hospitable sort of destination for investment. There's a lot more to say about that, but I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes I have talking about missiles because, on the one hand, the United States has this extremely potent financial weapon, as we've seen all throughout this conflict, but they also have very real weapons. And the issue of weapons, I'm not even going to touch the internal debates on the left, which I find to be somewhat uh, lacking in real substance. I'm not going to talk about whether or not to arm Ukraine. I'm opposed to arming Ukraine. I'm opposed to escalating this war. Defensive equipment, offensive equipment. However, we want to set the parameters of that debate. We can have that debate at some other time. I want to speak objectively about the nature of U.S. missiles on the Russian border because this is an absolutely tragic folly that could potentially, careen the entire world into a catastrophe. So Russia is already warning about US long range missiles and about those missiles being provided to Ukraine, and especially about what Ukraine might do with them. Again, the idea that Ukraine is a complete puppet of the United States with no agency of its own is absurd. It's what the kind of thing that Kremlin propagandists say. Real observers who understand the nature of this conflict and who understand sort of the various forces at play understand the Ukrainians are obviously depending on the United States and on NATO to supply them with weapons to help them in their fight against Russia. But the Ukrainians also know that they make the decisions on the ground. They make the decisions about what to target, even if they get help provided from the CIA or whomever. And that the reason I bring that up is because it raises the very real question of what exactly are we expecting to happen if the United States provides the missiles to the Ukrainians. Do we think that Biden could just direct the Ukrainians on how to use them? I don't think so. In other words, a tremendous amount of unpredictability becomes sort of infused in the situation with this. But anyway, let's get into the specifics. The reports are, and it seems like it's already been confirmed, the U.S. is sending, well, we know the U.S. is planning on sending roughly $40 billion in the form of that package that Biden has already announced. The missiles are called MLRS, Multiple Launch Rocket Systems, including the High Mobility Rocket System, HIMARS, HIMARS is the acronym for that. It's a form of multiple launch rocket system. Again, I'm not a military weapons expert. This is me just sort of repeating what's been reported here. It is the HIMARS or a type of MLR. Anyway, the point is these are missiles that have a range. I think it's roughly 80 to 150 kilometers or so. So it's, we're not talking like intercontinental ballistic missiles. We are talking about long range traditional missiles. What do you think is going to happen when the Ukrainians have those missiles? Well, the fear among many, including the Russians, is they might just start shooting at Russian cities. Forget the Russian soldiers in Ukraine. They could easily target Belgorod or Rostov or any of these cities along the Russia Ukraine border or near the border. What does that do? That escalates us now into not just Russia's war in Ukraine, but now a war taking place on both Ukrainian and Russian territory. It widens the scope of conflict, and obviously, it greatly increases the prospects of well, an escalation. I mean, it would be an escalation, but an even further escalation from the Russians. Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, has made several statements about this, both on Telegram and I believe publicly as well. He's said repeatedly that he hopes common sense will prevail. I agree with him. I would also say, well, let me just read his quote. Quote, this is from the Russian ambassador to the United States. Quote, we are calling for an end to the senseless and extremely risky pumping of weapons into Ukraine. It's important to refrain from threats against us and claims of a military victory for Ukraine, end quote. Hard to argue with that. I happen to agree with that. It is extremely risky, it is extremely dangerous, and it is extremely irresponsible to provide these kind of weapons to the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians have been invaded. They've been invaded by a foreign army. You cannot give them these weapons and then expect them not to use them in defending their country. You cannot give them these weapons and expect that they will, in all circumstances, abide by whatever verbal agreement they might offer. Whatever assurances Zelensky can give in a little Facebook video about, yeah, no, we need these long range missiles to fight against the Russians, but don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. We'll never use them against Russia. You don't know that. I don't know that. All we know for certain is that this greatly, greatly increases the chances of a major catastrophic war. Not a small war relegated to Ukraine, but a major catastrophic war. Is everybody really prepared for that? I don't think so. Many in Europe, including Nicolas Sarkozy, who is a right wing degenerate in his own right, have already expressed this fear that going along with US escalation against Russia and the sort of slow bleeding of Russia risks the possibility of essentially Armageddon, that the Europeans are sleepwalking into another world war. I agree with that. Much as I roundly condemn Russia's war crimes, and they are absolutely war crimes. They've committed crimes against humanity from February 24th and onward. Well, the criminals should be prosecuted for that, just as U.S. war criminals should be and are not prosecuted for their war crimes. But leaving that aside, we have a much larger issue at hand that goes way beyond the borders of Ukraine. This could be the end of Europe. This could be the end of human civilization if things take the worst possible turn. I think we need to be clear eyed and sober about what this ultimately means and what Biden is really doing here. Because, in fact, I would argue that the Biden administration, for the most part, has slow played the war in Ukraine fairly well. I mean, they've allowed the Russians to step into bear trap after bear trap, to walk on landmine after landmine. And yet, here we are, and Biden is now escalating. Anyway, we'll leave it there. Please do consider the danger of this. If you are on the left and you are supporting Ukraine and supporting the weapons being poured into Ukraine, think through very carefully what the implications are. I want to see Ukrainians be able to defend themselves. I want to see the Russian military ignominiously defeated and sent home after its criminal invasion. Of course I do. Just as I wanted to see the U.S. sent home with its tail between its legs from Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. That is, of course, our anti war position. But we can't have that position and ignore the larger threat of war. We have to be able to do both. And if you can't do both, then you can't fully appreciate the danger of the situation that we're in. All right, I'll leave it there. Go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Drates. There's so much more over there. Thanks as always for listening. Talk to you next time.